and welcome to this week's edition of Film Shocks with Hitchcock, my year-long journey with the master of suspense. And today we have the first Hitchcock film of the 1930s. It's Juno and the Paycock. Well, it's the first film of the 1930s unless you're looking at IMDb, where they list the year as 1929. I don't know what that's all about. Looking through Letterboxd this week, I didn't see any other Hitchcock films suddenly change the year they were released. That's been happening for the past few episodes. I don't know why, and some of the changes I don't really understand, but from everything that I've read, this film did in fact come out in 1930. It's based on a play by Sean O'Casey that was released in 1924, which was actually about the Irish Civil War that was going on between 1922 and 1923, which itself was predated by another war, the War of Irish Independence. So there's a lot of Irish history with this one, and I was told ahead of time that this was going to be an Irish comedy. It's not. There might be some comedic moments in it, but not really any more than what you find in a usual Hitchcock film. And really, this is Sean O'Casey's work. It's not much of a Hitchcock film. I would very lightly categorize it as such. It is a Sean O'Casey adaptation through and through. In fact, Sean O'Casey and Alfred Hitchcock sparked a bit of a friendship as this movie was being produced. So it's a bit of a reverse of what happened with the film The Manx Man, where the original writer of that production wouldn't stop bothering Hitchcock how he was going about filming his work. In this case, Sean O'Casey and Hitchcock got along very well. Now, does it turn into a really entertaining film? Well, it's debatable. I know Juno and the Paycock is a pretty well-known Irish stage show. I know Sean O'Casey has quite a legacy within Irish history. Juno and the Paycock is still done to this day. You can go on YouTube and watch modern productions of the same stage show. But should it be a Hitchcock film? And should it be released in 1930 just as the sound era was beginning? You know, this was the time when music scores were still very underutilized. And as far as sound went, people weren't really utilizing it for the artistic merit of it, but we're more so doing it so they wouldn't have to do intertitles anymore. They can have every one of the characters say the exposition themselves rather than showing it on screen. Hitchcock, in the Truffaut book, talks all about how the transition from silent to sound films brought down a lot of the artistic talent that was found in the silent age. And it's just funny because he immediately follows up Blackmail, which had a lot of intriguing uses of sound, with something like Juno and the Paycock, which is very bare bones, straight to the point, basically shooting the stage show as it's being done. And I'm not against this story, but I just don't think there was enough for Hitchcock to dig into with this one. I feel like he really appreciated Sean O'Casey as a talented writer, but he didn't really know how to turn those words into a film of his own. So if you're a Hitchcock fan, this is the farthest from what to expect with a typical Hitchcock movie. After the War for Irish Independence, there was a civil war between the anti-treaty IRA and the pro-treaty Irish Free State. The film centers around Captain Boyle, who is on the side of the anti-treaty IRA. As much as he's making a stand on the streets, speaking out to the crowds, he himself is not much of a worker. He goes home to his wife Juno, basically lays around, doesn't attempt to get a job, and he has two of his adult children living with him, Mary and Johnny. And Johnny himself actually fought in the War for Irish Independence. Juno considers her husband to be a bit useless and refers to him as the Paycock. Things move along at a very slow pace. By the time Charlie Bentham shows up, we're already at about the 40-minute mark. So it takes all this time for the story to even start going. It's starting to be very reminiscent of some other Hitchcock silent films, something like Champagne, where that story also didn't really start going until 40 minutes in. Charlie Bentham has an affection for Mary, but she's also being chased by a man named Jerry. However, Charlie, with his high status, ends up winning her over, and in the meantime, he tells the family that they're getting an inheritance. sort of randomly, out of nowhere, but there's a long-distant relative who's giving the captain some money. The set design does tell you that they live in a underclass home. Even if there's not a whole lot of variety of shots and different locations, we get a good sense that they are a poor family. Unfortunately, the captain is using that inheritance immediately as leverage to take out loans with other people. It's only towards the end that we find out the inheritance doesn't actually exist, and he owes all these people money. He ends up having to give up a lavish coat to a man he owed money to, and to the bartender downstairs, he had to give up his record player. There's also a subplot going on involving Johnny. You see, Johnny actually turned against the IRA. He's secretly been an informant for the Irish Free State, and he's given them some names, one of which ends up being killed. He feels awful about it and feels that the IRA may catch on to what he's doing. He's a very nervous persona throughout, and honestly, I think he is the only one that's giving a pretty good performance. He's portrayed by John Laurie, which is funny because he's supposed to be the son of the captain. The captain is played by Edward Chapman, and this is his first Hitchcock movie. We're going to see him a bit more in the future, but he was actually 4 years younger than the actor playing Johnny, yet in this movie, he's playing his father. So they really stretched the truth there. You can sometimes tell that Johnny himself is a lot older than he should be, but nevertheless, I think the actor does a good job. Sarah Allgood plays Juno and was pretty famous for playing the character Juno in the actual stage production that predates this movie. And of course, I should mention that John Longden, who was the lead of Blackmail, is in the film as Charles Bentham. As we get to the end, Johnny is unfortunately killed by the IRA, and Mary herself gets pregnant by Charles, but at that point, Charles wants nothing to do with her. He's not going to marry her. This means that Jerry has another shot at her, but once he finds out she's pregnant, he also wants nothing to do with her. Essentially, the film ends on sadness. On a sad note, it doesn't even really know how to wrap itself up. It's just dread. This family has had bad luck all around, and things fade out. For being a pretty packed movie, I did wrap up the plot pretty quickly, but that's the thing. I feel like it just drags things on for way longer than necessary. It's unfortunate because the previous film, Blackmail, managed to have a really good pace and tell its story, somewhat small story, in a matter of minutes. This film feels a lot longer. It does have a bit more story there, but again, it might be a faithful adaptation, but that doesn't mean that as a sound film from 1930, it's not going to feel awkwardly paced today. This movie really could use some music. It could use a bit more variety in the way it was shot, in the way the film is edited. Surprisingly, Hitchcock doesn't really bring any of that to this movie. For the most part, he's doing long takes, some of which can go on for as long as 4 minutes. I haven't read the play by Sean O'Casey, but people have given it high remarks, so I have to imagine that if people consider this a good adaptation, a very strong adaptation, that must mean most of the dialogue is still carried over from the original play. However, I don't think it works today. This was the slowest of all the Hitchcock films so far, and oftentimes on lists of best Hitchcock films, this one always ranks near the bottom, sometimes the very bottom. However, that doesn't mean that the entire film is a dud. There's certainly some stuff there to help it. For instance, we have John Laurie as Johnny. I think he has a fine enough performance. And there is some humor and music. They sing some Irish songs halfway through. One of the characters, Miss Madigan, who's the bartender below, she is singing along, but is starting the chorus at the wrong time for every verse. They get ticked off at her every time, so I guess that's a little bit funny, but maybe I'm just looking for more humor in a film that was basically humorless. Very dry, I guess is a good way to describe it. It doesn't help that there's not a good transfer of this film either. This is one of the few Hitchcock films that hasn't seen a Blu-ray release, hasn't really seen a DVD release either. It was released in Britain, but even that version is not restored. This wasn't part of the Hitchcock 9, the 9 films that the BFI restored in 2012. I don't know why they didn't decide to do some of his early sound films, seeing that they have just about as bad existing transfers as some of the silent films did. They cleaned up all the silent movies, but I think Juno and the Paycock could use a brushing up of some sort. Every version of this movie that exists in the United States is essentially a bootleg. It's available in the Mill Creek set of Hitchcock movies, but it's an awful, awful transfer, and it doesn't help when every character is speaking in a thick Irish accent. I know there's a lot of Irish history with this one. There's also a lot of Irish dialect, and I'm sure there's also a lot of Irish phrases that I probably can't pick up on, but even if I wanted to, I can't turn subtitles on. There's not a subtitle track for this, and it also has such bad quality, it's hard to keep up. That's the unfortunate thing about a lot of early movies. If they don't have a good transfer, it is going to ruin the experience to a degree, especially if the movie is tough to follow already. I got the basic plot points, but there's a lot to sit through here, a lot of dialogue that I wish I could dig into more, but I just don't have the chance to do it. Does that mean that if they restore it in the future that I'll immediately want to jump on this? Probably not, because even without the dialogue, it's not the most lavish production to come from Hitchcock. This is going to be pretty rough, but I gave this a 1.5 out of 5 stars. I know some people might give it higher remarks, but for me, even if you're a strong, faithful adaptation, I just don't see the point in doing a very by-the-numbers filming style to capture the play, when you could just do the play, or better yet, do something like Hamilton, where you just film the play actually going on stage. You don't have to make a movie out of it, especially if you're only going to have things limited to one location for the most part. So there's Juno and the Paycock. Not a lot to dig into with this one. Very basic. Even the stuff that Hitchcock brings up in the Truffaut book is not very detailed. It's not really about the production itself. It's mostly about his relationship to O'Casey. He also talks about the process of adapting something from a novel or stage show, and how he usually would read it and then immediately start working on the film. And he made some points here. He said, like, for instance, when he did The Birds, he made the film, but he went to film his own movie. If he were to be asked during that interview, he would have no idea what to say about the book. He wouldn't remember it. So I found that kind of fascinating. It almost seems like he was trying his best not to stay faithful to the original source material. He wanted to make something different from it, which, in the case of Juno and the Paycock, it's the complete opposite. He made something very faithful, from what I've read online. So that kind of wraps up this one. I'll be moving on next week to Murder and its German counterpart, Mary, which does have a Blu-ray release through Kino, so thank God, getting a better transfer again. But I should mention the film that he was involved in that was also released in 1930, ELSTREE CALLING. What is there to say about ELSTREE CALLING? Well, this is what Hitchcock had to say to Truffaut. Of no interest whatsoever. I said that quote last week, but I think it's hilarious that that's all he has to say about ELSTREE CALLING, and it's understandable why. I have read differing opinions online about what level of involvement Hitchcock had in this film. The original film was done by Adrian Brunel. It's Britain's version of a Hollywood review film, something like King of Jazz, Hollywood on Parade, or The Broadway Melody. These are the celebrities of Elstree Studios, which, of course, Hitchcock was working at the time. For whatever reason, Adrian Brunel stepped away from the production, and Hitchcock stepped in. The film itself credits Hitchcock as doing the sketches and other interpolated items, whatever that means. I mean, that's an interesting credit. I've certainly never seen that in any film ever. I will say, too, the opening credits of this movie are fantastic. It's a lot of fun for something from 1930. But beyond that, it's very basic, what you would see from a Hollywood review show of the same era. And is it something that's worth watching today? Well, let's really dig into it, because honestly, it's not one that you have to focus on a lot, but there is an enjoyment similar to the Hollywood review shows that make it for a fun enough sit. Nothing special, and it's definitely not a Hitchcock movie. It's said that Hitchcock was only involved in the Gordon Harker sketch, the one involving Shakespeare, and the one that I guess is the most like a Hitchcock film, which involves a man, Jameson Thomas, walking into an apartment and shooting a couple, only to find out he's in the wrong apartment, and I guess he shot the wrong couple. even that, though it's funny, doesn't really have a lot of backstory to it. In fact, with less backstory, it almost makes it a little bit funnier. I actually posted that on TikTok. This is kind of a tangent, but I found the scene so ridiculous, given that it was from 1930 and I knew Hitchcock definitely did it. I posted it on TikTok and it got quite a few views, and a lot of people were saying it was funny. So that's the thing. Humor, it can work even 90 years later. Actually, Adrian Brunel said in his autobiography that he shot the sketch involving Shakespeare, but the producers made him redo it. So I guess that's why Hitchcock ended up stepping in. The Shakespeare stuff actually involves Donald Calthrop, who was Tracy in Blackmail. It's basically him trying to perform Shakespeare, but he's trying to make it relevant, trying to make it exciting for the audience. He keeps explaining that Shakespeare can be quite tiring and boring, so he's gonna really spice it up. Every time he starts talking, a curtain falls on him, and there's multiple curtains. It's a bit silly. It actually works as a humorous moment. The sketch involving Gordon Harker is about a family trying to make a TV work. Yeah, it's a weird thing. There's a TV in this. I didn't even realize TV existed in the 1930s. I guess at the time, John Logie Bard was actually working on the first TV ever. So people were already hearing about this new experimental technology called TV. However, in the film, it looks more like a modern day, very small, very antique version of a flat screen TV, weirdly enough. By the time they finally get a signal to go through, the movie ends. So I guess it's another little funny moment. And like I said, there's the scene with Jameson Thomas where he walks into the wrong apartment. There's a couple making out and he shoots them. And it's funny. That's actually the funniest part of the whole movie. So overall, I guess since these are the funniest parts, it would make sense that Hitchcock was behind them. It also makes sense that the only sequences Hitchcock was involved in were also the ones that featured alumni from Hitchcock films. This movie still was ambitious for the time, even with all the different popular talents that were in it. It was also utilizing a film technique called path color. This was film tinting done through stencils, so select objects within the frame could be tinted. It makes for a very yellowish effect. I don't think it works that well. It's understandable why things ended up going the route of Technicolor instead. And frankly, there are some impressive moments in this. Teddy Brown is playing the drums, and it's amazing how he can move his hands and get that drum to go the way it does. It's impressive to watch even today. Anna May Wong, who would later show up in the Shanghai Express, makes an appearance during the pie throwing scene. Lily Morris has a pretty funny song about always being a bridesmaid but never the bride. There's some impressive tap dancing. There's a musical number done in Russian. It has a mix of different things. Very much Britain's version of the Hollywood Review. Granted, there are some pretty awkward moments in it. The Three Eddies show up. I didn't even know what the Three Eddies were. This is their only credited appearance in any film, according to Letterboxd. They show up and they're all blackface performers. So there you go. There's also a pretty funny skit involving a quartet. Every time they're singing this song, they get to a part where one of the men can't do the note. They flub it. They all stare at him. They walk off stage. You hear a gunshot, and then only three come back. So every time someone flubs the note, someone's getting shot off stage. You see a puff of smoke. It's funny. And how do they end it? Well, there's one guy left. He flubs it, and as they shoot him, he has blackface, and he does the whole mammy routine. It's awkward. It's awful. Why did you end that whole funny skit with something so terribly not funny? And also nowadays, completely outdated. It's unfortunate because this movie does have some actually funny moments, but overall, it's nothing special. It's not a Hitchcock movie. I don't really know how to judge something like this. I'm not going to return to it. I didn't hate watching it. It's certainly a slice of what entertainment was in the 1930s, especially from Britain, but really this is not anything I think is worth seeking out. Realistically, if someone could just post the clips of the Hitchcock scenes, the ones that everyone can agree on is probably the Hitchcock scenes, and just release them as short films, there, just watch those and you've seen every Hitchcock movie. You don't really need to see the rest of this. And this one also doesn't have a DVD release in the United States at all. It is bootlegged a lot. You can find it online. It's on YouTube. Very easy to find. It's easier to find than Juno and the Paycock. But I think that's going to wrap it up for this episode. A bit of an unexpected double feature, and it looks like next week I'll be doing the same thing, as I'll be watching Hitchcock do a film and then do that same exact film for the German audience. And let me know what you thought of Juno and the Paycock, and if you've checked it out, let me know what you think of ELSTREE Calling. Thanks so much for the comments and listening to this episode, and we'll see you next time.
This concludes my part of the program. Next time I shall return with another story